Lie 1. JFK was a devoted husband. In August of 1956, Jackie Kennedy gave birth to a baby girl who was already dead, a stillbirth, and while she was recovering in the hospital, thousands of miles away, her husband was in a boat in the Mediterranean, surrounded by bikini babes and models. And when he finally heard the news, he did not go home to his grieving wife. Instead, he reportedly told his brother, "The baby is lost, what's done is done." And he stayed on the boat. Jackie and John's marriage worked more like a business deal than a real relationship. Joe Kennedy Sr., the father of the family, is said to have paid Jackie around $1 million just to stay married to his son, and that deal even came with bonus money tied to how many sexually transmitted infections John kept giving her. And the cheating was not just a few private mistakes here and there, because it was closer to a regular habit run right out of the White House, with several accounts describing almost daily pool parties full of young female staff. The clearest example is a woman named Mimi Alford, who started an affair with the president in the summer of 1962 when she was only 19 and just 4 days into her White House internship after he invited her to swim in the pool. She later said she lost her virginity to him in a room right next to the First Lady's own bedroom, and that on another occasion, he told her to perform a sex act on one of his aides while he sat and watched. Months later, he tried to pass her off to his own brother Ted, saying, "Why don't you take care of my baby brother? He could stand a little relaxation." She said no to that one. The most dangerous part of all this, though, had nothing to do with sex and everything to do with the mob. One of Kennedy's girlfriends, Judith Campbell, was at the same time also dating a Chicago crime boss named Sam Giancana, and she has said that she personally carried sealed envelopes back and forth between the president and the gangster, which basically made her a messenger between the White House and organized crime. Lie 2. The Kennedys wasn't involved in the death of Marilyn Monroe. On the night of May 19, 1962, inside a packed Madison Square Garden, Marilyn Monroe was sewn into a dress so tight that she had to be helped up the steps to the microphone. And there, before 15,000 people and a sitting president, she breathed out the most famous happy birthday in American history. When she finished, John F. Kennedy joked that he could now retire from politics, having had it sung to him in such a sweet, wholesome way. The whole country was in on the flirtation. What it did not know was that the flirtation was real, that it allegedly ran through both the president and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and that Monroe, lonely, unstable, and increasingly bitter about being passed between the two most powerful men in the world, had reportedly begun writing down what they told her in private. Secrets about the United States at the height of the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement. Less than 3 months later, on August 4th of 1962, she was found dead in the bedroom of that same Brentwood home, lying face down and unclothed with one arm stretched toward a telephone, and the world was handed the simplest explanation. A fragile star had swallowed too many pills. Almost immediately, suspicion gathered. The coroner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, checked every inch of her body for an injection mark and found nothing, opened her stomach expecting a pill residue and found nothing there either, and then watched her organs get destroyed before he could run further tests. Decades later, at 98 years old, he finally said what he'd been holding back. He believed he was deliberately restricted from investigating, potentially to prevent her from revealing secrets about the influential Kennedy family. The FBI had already been watching her for years, flagging her as a security matter. And according to multiple accounts, Robert Kennedy was at her house that same night, ending the affair, and it turned into a screaming match. Private investigator Fred Otash claimed he had a live wiretap running and caught the whole thing. Monroe screaming that she'd been passed around like a piece of meat, RFK demanding to know where her diary was, and then, according to Otash's own notes, muffling her cries with a pillow to keep the neighbors from hearing. Hours later, she was dead, and her last documented phone call was to her hairstylist saying, "I know a lot of secrets about the Kennedys, dangerous ones." Then, in June 2026, a TV special AI reconstructed her Brentwood bedroom exactly as it was found, and their conclusion made the suicide story fall apart even further. Her sheets were undisturbed, her pill bottles weren't knocked over or scattered. They were lined up in a neat row with every single label deliberately facing outward. A woman convulsing from a fatal overdose doesn't die and then tidy her own crime scene like a display case. Somebody staged that room after she was already gone. Lie 3. The CIA wasn't involved in JFK's murder. In November of 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald, and within just a few days, a man named Gary Underhill began telling his friends that Oswald wasn't acting on his own. Underhill was not some random conspiracy theorist, because he was a decorated intelligence veteran from the Second World War who had actually worked inside the CIA and was trusted as an expert on secret warfare. He told the people close to him that a small clique within the CIA had killed the president, that these men were dangerous, and that he was now afraid for his own life and might have to leave the country. Less than 6 months later, Gary Underhill was found shot dead in his Washington apartment, and although the coroner called it a suicide, the friends who heard his very specific warnings found that ruling almost impossible to accept. For a long time, this sounded like the kind of story that could never really be checked, until the US government slowly began releasing its secret files, and some of what came out was genuinely hard to explain anyway. A CIA officer named George Joanides had been quietly running a group of anti-Castro Cuban exiles who had direct contact and conflict with Lee Harvey Oswald in the months before the assassination. Years later, when Congress finally set up a committee to investigate Kennedy's murder, the CIA assigned that very same George Joanides to work as its go-between with those investigators, and he never once told him about his own earlier role. In plain terms, the agency put a man with a hidden connection to Oswald in charge of helping to investigate Oswald, and kept that quiet for decades. Lie 4. Joe Kennedy Sr. was a great family man. In the late 1930s, Joe Kennedy Sr. was the head of the family and the man building the whole Kennedy dynasty, and he was sent to London as the United States ambassador to Britain. That job is where his darker side came out. Hitler was rising across Europe, and President Roosevelt wanted America to take a firm stand against the Nazis, but Joe Kennedy pushed the other way and worked against his own president to keep America out and make peace with Germany. He even reportedly said that Jewish people deserved their fate under Hitler, and historians today call his time as ambassador one of the most shameful periods in American diplomacy. And this was not just one man with ugly private opinions, because those views ran right through the family home. His oldest son, Joe Kennedy Jr., the boy his father was grooming to become president one day, wrote letters during the Spanish Civil War supporting the fascist side. In that house, these ideas were not treated as something shameful, but as normal, everyday thinking. Joe Sr. was raising his children inside his own worldview, and that worldview put power and image above almost everything else. And then there's what he did to his own daughter. In 1941, Joe Kennedy approved an experimental operation called a lobotomy on his daughter Rosemary, who was 23, hoping it would calm the mood swings and outbursts the family struggled to control. The surgery was done by a doctor named Walter Freeman, and it went horribly wrong. It left Rosemary permanently disabled, unable to walk properly or speak clearly for the rest of her life. The family then placed her in an institution, far from the cameras, and kept her hidden for decades while everyone else rose to power. So, the real Joe Kennedy Sr. was not a devoted family father at all, but a man who sided with a genocidal regime when it suited him, and who had part of his own daughter's brain destroyed to remove a problem. A man who treated his family and his morals as tools to protect the family name. Lie 5. The Kennedys were cursed. On the night of July 18, 1969, Senator Ted Kennedy drove his car off a small wooden bridge on Chappaquiddick Island and into a dark tidal pond. He got out of the sinking car and swam to safety, but his passenger, a 28-year-old campaign worker named Mary Jo Kopechne, did not, and she drowned. What Ted Kennedy did next is the part that still shocks people. He did not call the police, and he did not call for help. Instead, he went back to his hotel and waited about 10 hours before finally reporting the accident the next morning. Investigators later found more than 100 differences in the witness accounts of that night, and reporting suggests his legal team coached witnesses before the inquest, which means the tragedy was quietly handled like a crisis to be managed rather than treated like the accident it was. Almost 30 years later, that same reckless streak showed up again. On New Year's Eve in 1997, Robert Kennedy's son, Michael, was on a family ski trip in Aspen, where the family was playing a game of football on skis, throwing a ball around while racing down the mountain. Ski patrol staff had already warned them that the game was dangerous, but they kept playing anyway, and Michael skied straight into a tree headfirst and was killed. Then came the death that felt most like fate of all. On July 16, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. took off in his private plane heading to Martha's Vineyard with his wife Caroline and her sister Lauren on board, and he crashed into the Atlantic Ocean at night, killing 3 of them. But when investigators looked into it, they found no engine failure, no sabotage, and no outside interference. What they found instead was a young pilot with only about 300 hours of experience who was not trained or licensed to fly on his instruments alone, choosing to fly at night over dark, hazy water where he could not see the horizon. The cause was not bad luck, it was a chain of avoidable choices. And that is the real story behind the so-called Kennedy curse. Again and again, the tragedy does not come from some mysterious force hanging over the family, but from specific, avoidable human decision. Driving away from a crash instead of calling for help, playing a game everyone was warned about, or flying at night without the training to do it safely. The curse was never magic. It was the same mix of recklessness and image control that runs right through the whole family story, all the way to the end.